Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of the Cyber Risk Podcast. I am your host, Resha, VP of Product Marketing at Safe Security. Last time, we had a great chat with David Riley about the cyber risk fundamentals. And today, we will be digging into a topic that's crucial for keeping your businesses secure and thriving. So joining me today is Zach, an expert in risk management who has worked with businesses of all sizes to help them build resilient strategies. Zach, it's so great to have you here today.
Oh, thank you so much, Resha. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. Managing risk at scale seems daunting, but it doesn't have to be overwhelming as long as you have the right skill sets, the right tools, and the right processes in place. So I'm excited to chat about that today.
Absolutely, because when you break it down, the process becomes so much more manageable. So Zach, before we jump in, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, Resha. So I'm Zach Cossairt. I manage the integrated risk management program at Equinix, and I work with a team of very talented FAIR practitioners that allow us to implement FAIR-based risk quantification at scale.
So Zach, to kick things off, I want to talk about the big picture. What are the desired outcomes for a business and why it is so important for them to define these clearly when assessing risks?
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point, Resha. So when we're looking at the outcomes, essentially they're goals that the business is looking to achieve. They could be things like revenue growth, instilling customer trust, digital transformation, operational efficiency, releasing products on time. A lot of things can associate with the outcomes an organization wants to achieve. And risk in and of itself involves threats to outcomes that we value. So when you clearly understand those outcomes your business wants to achieve, then it's a little bit easier to understand what could potentially derail those outcomes. And that's what we're trying to protect against. And I think about it this way. If the outcome you're trying to achieve is customer trust, then realize risks like data breaches and system outages can keep you from achieving that outcome. It allows you to give the right risk management resources to the things that matter most. And if you don't do this, your risk assessments, you run the risk of your risk assessments lacking focus, lacking, any sort of direction, and maybe even not informing the decisions that matter most to your organization. And that's what we truly want to avoid.
Right. And I imagine this step also helps business prioritize. So like if you know your outcome, you can spot which are the risks are the most pressing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You can better evaluate which scenarios, if they were to actually occur, would result in the greatest threat to achieving those outcomes. And then you can, subsequently prioritize risk management efforts on the most significant risks that could impact those business outcomes.
And I think that is a super amazing and very helpful perspective because it's like setting a destination before you plan the route. And as we know, that's very, very critical. So moving on, now that once the outcomes are clear and we know what we are going towards, how do you approach scoping the different segments of a business? And, what kind of challenges arises in this process?
Yes. So here it's about really breaking down your business into manageable pieces. And each one of these pieces is associated with some sort of functional goals that help the organization achieve those business outcomes that we just talked about, right? So I kind of like to think of it as a library, right? A library is filled with lots of books everywhere, associated with different genres, and each genre may describe a different sort of risk. Now, if the library is just left unorganized, well, visitors come and they don't know what they're looking for. And, essentially the library is kind of useless. It can't be navigated efficiently. So the library is made manageable by being segmented based on genres and topics. So you can find things and everything's clearly labeled. And so to, relate this to what we're doing, one genre would be IT department. IT, they want to focus on cyber threats. While your operational teams, they might want to focus on supply chain attacks, for instance. And then in complete contrast, you've got a product team who cares about the exploitability of their code that they're writing. So the challenging part here is, as you can imagine, all these risks aren't necessarily centralized to one area of the business. A cyber threat for instance, that is a threat to an IT system. Well, that IT system might be supporting some operational process. So that means that an IT system that's taken offline, say due to a ransomware event, could potentially support critical operations. And that outage could lead to inefficiencies. It could lead to delays, a lot of things that could be bad for the business, right? If a product team is developing some sort of new software and it's being supported by an application with IT infrastructure, well, what happens if the IT infrastructure goes down due to an outage? Well, the product team then cannot implement the system development lifecycle that they're being paid to do. So as we can see that it's not a simple process, but there are ways to kind of mitigate this and make sure that everyone's speaking the same language.
No, makes sense. And talking about useless library, I want to just point out at the unorganized books behind me, but we'll not talk about that. So this interconnectedness, and working with multiple kind of teams, that must make it tricky to plan. So how do you account for those ripple effects?
Yeah, it's definitely a bit of an art and a science when it comes to these kind of conversations that you have. But really, the key for me is to have all the right people in the room when you're going through these risk scoping exercises and data gathering exercises. It's about having those kind of collaborative discussions about how one risk materializing over here could affect multiple areas in different areas of the organization. In a way, it's kind of like a group therapy session, and you're the one kind of running things. After a while, I found that you become pretty skilled in these more nuanced communications, and you get really, really good at active listening. You're kind of playing that therapy role a lot. But developing these kind of softer skills not only makes these conversations that you're having a good use of everyone's scarce and valuable time, which is very, very important, but those relationships that you build when you're having them pay off in the long run. And then, you end up learning something yourself pretty much in every single one of these calls, and that's just an added bonus.
No, absolutely. That makes sense. Now, you mentioned an interesting thing that you mentioned involving key people, which is kind of tricky. Like if cybersecurity, there is silos that people operate in, which they don't talk. And at the same time, there is overlap. So the same things is done by multiple teams. So how do you decide who's the key owners, and who are they, and how do you identify their roles in delivering the key results?
Yeah, that's a great question and great way to transition into what is a pretty challenging problem when we're kind of implementing these risk management programs is the overall idea of ownership. But for me, the way I kind of advise is when you're looking for key owners, those are essentially the leaders or the teams sometimes that are responsible for making decisions, right? They're directing actions. They're applying resources that make the crucial parts of the business function smoothly, right? We can think of the engineering leads, the product managers, the department heads, right? People where the buck stops with decision making for the most part. To find them, I find you can kind of ask yourself, who would get that call, right? If the first call, if the process supporting the business or the function stopped working or was no longer providing support, who would be the person that they called, right? If, for example, compliance is the key outcome that we're talking about, well, your legal and your policy team is likely a key owner there, right? And once you kind of identify who these people are, who these teams are, you go out there and you should be having conversations with these people, right? Real human to human conversations because they have such valuable insights. They're maintaining those structures and the processes that manage their own operations, and they're familiar and very close with the day-to-day risks. So these are people that you should be talking about and building relationships. They should definitely know your name and where to go to at all times.
Good. Now, are they also the ones who would likely execute the solutions?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So, anyone familiar with the Institute of Internal Auditors or the IAA's 3 lines model? It's actually a pretty popular model that people tend to know about. They'll recognize these stakeholders as the first line, right? These are your risk takers and your risk owners. Their participation in this whole risk management process, it's not just recommended, it's actually required for success at scale because risk management itself is a shared responsibility. It's not one person's responsibility, and accountability by those business owners and the executives that are needed in these situations. They're the ones executing the solutions for our risk dilemmas, and it's a must for them to be involved from start to finish.
No, that That makes sense. And, since they are directly involved in navigating these solutions, you also, ensure their buy-in. So that's a great idea. Now, Zach, once you have the key owners and, segments in focus, how do you map out the risks and their potential consequences in a structured way?
Yeah, we want to make our library manageable, right? So one of the ways that I've found to be most effective here is to tap into your organization's business impact analysis, or BIA. That's pretty widely known. It's a business continuity and disaster recovery planning and prioritization tool. And, I will say that the mileage that you get out of a BIA will definitely vary organization to organization. Some are more mature than others, right? So it's not like it's going to be textbook across the board. But generally speaking, this is kind of where the documentation of recovery objectives, your service delivery criteria, your business criticality, and then if you're lucky, the data classification of the most important information assets. And a lot of the times those important information assets are then mapped to the business and the functions that they support. So that's one way of really, mapping out your risks. I find it a decent approach to kind of map your risks and there's adverse effects or those consequences to those crown jewels and the business units, the line of business, the regional functions that they support, pretty much those that are looking to achieve the outcomes that we defined earlier.
Yeah, no, that's a very clean way to prioritize. And I imagine this helps team takes actions faster because now they know which risks are exactly critical.
No, you got it. I mean, in my view, if we're doing things right, then we should really be improving the pace and improving the quality of risk-based decision making in the most critical areas of your business.
So risk scenarios can take this step further. So what, according to you, Zach, makes a good risk scenario? And can you share an example with us?
Oh, yes, definitely. Risk scenarios is by far, you kind of have to know what you're measuring in order for you to manage it. So making sure that you have a good risk scenario is incredibly important. So maybe we'll start quickly with the definition of risk, right? The definition of risk that I tend to lean on, of course, this is up for interpretation and everyone could kind of have their own definition. But what I tend to lean on is risk is an uncertain future event that, if it were to materialize, has the potential to adversely impact valued outcomes, right? We talked about those outcomes and I really like to focus on those. So a risk scenario then should really provide some sort of narrative of exactly that. I find that the open fair standards actually do a really good job of defining what should be included in a risk scenario. And they do that from the perspective of the primary stakeholder, right? That who's going to witness the risk if it were to materialize. And the flow that they've kind of laid out and defined is you've got a threat that breaches or impairs some sort of asset, causing an observable loss event that has direct consequences and may, not always, but may have reaction from others. Okay. So an example of this, if we were just to kind of lay one out there, is a nation state actor, okay, remotely exploits an external facing application service, resulting in the execution of ransomware and the exfiltration of sensitive data. So we can see there that it's a scenario. It's something that we can actually apply a likelihood and an impact to. And that's when you know that you actually have a risk that you can quantify. Another very important thing to understand with risk scenarios is it's always forward looking, right? That is something that we have to remember here. It should be an uncertain future event that may or may not occur. And it's our job as risk managers and risk analysts to use the information that we have available to estimate how often we expect the event to occur and how much loss is likely to result if it does.
Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is this helps bringing the hypothetical, if you will, into focus and, breaking it down in the way you said makes it very concrete and makes it actionable. Correct?
Absolutely. Yes. And one thing to understand too, we have to somewhat put guardrails on what we call hypotheticals because we want to make sure that we're analyzing the things that are most probable and not everything possible. The way you can look at it is diminishing returns absolutely apply to risk scoping.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. But Zach, let me kind of double dive into one thing. You said every risk is not predictable, right? Like this is potential, probable. So how do businesses evaluate the likelihood of risks, especially the unpredictable ones?
Yeah. So, I mean, most people in this field that you talk to will tell you firsthand that we're not in the business of predicting anything, right? We don't state things with certainty because the future is, of course, inherently uncertain. Rather, we're forecasters, right? Much like you see people that are forecasting the weather and people that are forecasting the spread of disease and economic and market trends, often in the same way. We make judgments, and as Daniel Kahneman and his co-authors in their acclaimed book Noise define it, a judgment is a measurement where the human mind is the instrument, right? That's essentially what we're looking at when we're making a judgment. And we measure the likelihood of certain risks using probabilities, right? Our goal with these measurements is to make it accurate, meaning that if we were to estimate an event to happen 10% of the time, let's say, and we reran the event in 10 distinct futures, we would expect that event to happen 1 out of 10 times. That's what we're talking about when we make an estimate of a 10% probability. Now, to inform these estimates, you need data, right? And you kind of want to first start with the statistical or the outside view, right? That's when we're using base rate information from external sources like the Verizon DBIR and the Scientia reports, right? Whatever you kind of use, that tells us kind of how common some event is within a broader class. And that class can be defined as your industry, right? As we see, it could be defined as all of the Fortune 500. You kind of choose that class. You should just be specific when you're doing so. So we kind of do that because it's important to us in many ways. From there, that's when we leverage all of our internal data specific to our organization, which allows us to kind of adjust our judgments from those priors to something that we're more confident in. Oh, and it's incredibly important to understand that a likelihood judgment itself is only valid when it's time bound. Right? We measure the estimate of an event's likelihood. It has to be within some established time frame of reference. Most commonly a year is what we use. And that's important because if you consider the likelihood of any risk scenario on an infinite timeline, well, it's going to approach 100% pretty much all the time. And that's not really helpful in decision making.
That makes sense. Zach, can you help summarize for our audience?
So to summarize, we're really not in the business of predicting anything, right? We're making probabilistic estimates because the future is uncertain. And the way that we do that is using base rate information, looking at outside statistical information to help, and then including information internal to our organization to adjust our estimates based on more specific information. From there, we make a judgment that is always time bound, always has a time associated with it to make sure that we're not assessing everything possible and only what is probable.
Got it. So moving on, Zach, one of the big challenges businesses face is, trying to quantify potential losses from risk. It's easy to say, hey, this could be bad, but attaching an actual number, that, seems a little bit of a gray area, right? So what are some tools or methods that you used to get meaningful estimates?
Yes, you're definitely right, Resha. Quantifying potential losses, it can absolutely feel a little bit daunting, but it's essential for us to really understand the risk landscape. And your primary focus here is not to attempt to put a single number on a loss, right? We're always taught to not use those point estimates. It gets back to what we said before about wanting to be accurate in our estimates of the future. The goal for any risk manager and analyst when forecasting is to make accurate estimates to a useful level of precision. So here's a good way to look at it. Let's do a little exercise. Resha, how would you estimate my height?
Since I met you, I don't know, maybe 6 feet, 2 inches or something like that? North of 6 feet?
All right. So there you go. You kind of made, in that case, it was a point estimate and you gave a little bit of wiggle room, but most of the time you wouldn't use a point estimate because the likelihood of you being correct is quite low, right? You'd probably want to use the information that you know about me, which you did, and provide some sort of range that you believe the true value falls within. And how precise that range is, meaning how wide or narrow it is, absolutely depends on the decision that the forecast is meant to support. So for example, if you were building me a house, Resha, which feel free to go ahead and do that right on the Puget Sound, that'd be awesome. If you were building me a house and wanted to know how tall to make the doorways, your need for precision in measuring my height would be a lot different than if you were, say, inviting me to an amusement park and wanted to make sure that I could get on all the rides. So you see what I'm saying here? It's all dependent on the decision that you're supporting.
Okay. So Zach, once you have identified risk and, started quantifying losses, the next challenge is consistency. Why is it important to apply a consistent framework for analyzing risk? And, how can organizations ensure that this process is repeatable?
That's a great question here, Resha. And really consistency is key because it allows us to create a space for more effective comparisons to be made so the decisions can be well informed, right? And that's why there's frameworks like FAIR. FAIR is a framework and a model that breaks down risk into measurable parts and helps you calculate the potential financial impact in dollars and cents. This more data-driven approach, of course, we understand is a drastic improvement upon the more qualitative assessments that probably do not inform decisions at the best they could, which is why we're utilizing frameworks like FAIR.
Okay, that absolutely makes sense, Zach. So now this brings us to another big question in the room. Once you have all of this, great risk data, how do you deliver those insights to the people who care about very different things? And what I mean is executives want the big picture, but operational teams may need the nitty-gritty. The regulators may want another thing, and the board may want absolutely another thing. So what's the best way to address these varying priorities?
Yeah, great question. And a very, very interesting challenge in our landscape today. Resha, thanks. And this is an area really where an understanding of kind of how humans think and make choices can definitely enhance our ability to communicate information that supports decision making, because our objective here is to design an environment that optimally conveys the information so that effective choices can be made and ultimately acted upon. So different groups and stakeholders employ various different strategies for decision making, and it's our responsibility to recognize these differences and tailor our communications and our reporting accordingly. Executives, for instance, they're typically pretty skilled at understanding what information they need to consider and what can be deprioritized. They can shed their load and they can concentrate on what truly matters. So when communicating risks to this group of stakeholders, it's really important to understand their information needs and present it in a clear and accessible manner. So that kind of facilitates a smooth decision-making process.
Okay, so keep it high level for the leadership. Understood. Now, what about the operational teams?
The operational teams, practically speaking, it's a bit different for these teams, but the underlying concepts that we talked about before remain unchanged. If they're the ones making the decision, then their strategy might be a little bit different. The depth and the breadth of the information they need is likely to be much more than that of an executive. But as risk managers and choice architects, we should still be reducing the complexity and presenting the information in a clear and straightforward way. The key distinction, though, in implementing risk management within this group is that we're actively executing the risk decisions made by the leaders. And we're trying to achieve success in this context, which requires different communication strategies. It's essential that all team members understand their roles and responsibilities. They're capable of carrying them out, and most importantly, they're motivated to do so. This involves aligning our incentives to focus on a shared objective and ensuring that everyone has a vested interest in the outcome. When team members feel invested, they're more likely to collaborate and support one another.
No, absolutely. That totally resonates. All right. So this brings us to our last question for today, and that is about staying proactive with real-time data. So how can businesses use real-time monitoring tools to keep the visibility and, address new risks as and when they're emerging in real time?
Yeah, telemetry from security tools and threat sources is definitely non-negotiable if your intention is to actually scale risk quantification as continuous decision support. It automates our risk management process by streamlining processes and integrating that contextualized data and facilitating communication and reporting. So these real-time insights provide that visibility and the feedback loop that's necessary for the risk landscape as a system to operate effectively. And as a bonus, we can treat this kind of upfront investment to get that data that allows us to quantify risks continuously and accurately as a fixed cost. And that fixed cost allows us to realize economies of scale by reducing the average cost per assessment when we can spread that out across a large number of assessments.
So that's good to know. Now, beyond these tools, what else should businesses do to stay ahead of those risks and, be proactive?
I would say to conduct tabletop exercises, right? Tabletop exercises for all of your top risks, if they're stored in a risk register, wherever you kind of have them stored, to kind of simulate the incidents and evaluate the effectiveness of your response plan, right? This is especially important in today's day and age since the release of the SEC cybersecurity rule, which places a lot of urgency on organizations to be able to assess and disclose material cybersecurity incidents in the timely, accurate, and comparable way. So if we have all these tabletops, we can already understand the actions that are going to be taken for our risk if it was to materialize, and it can facilitate the decision around materiality that is usually made by the legal organization or someone else.
Got it. And if I'm giving some cheesy examples, I'm presuming it's like having both smoke detector and the fire extinguisher in your toolkit.
Yes, that's a good analogy. Yes, very, very nice.
Zach, thank you so much. It's been such an insightful conversation, and thank you for breaking this down in a way that's so easy for me to understand. It's so easy for our viewers to understand. And I think our listeners are walking away with some great actionable tips that they can start using.
Thanks, Resha. I really enjoyed the chat today, and I hope this gives our listeners some practical insights that they can use to know, understand, and communicate risk with their organizations.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into the episode 2 of Cyber Risk Podcast. If you found this useful, please don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, or share it with your colleagues. We will be back soon with more tips and interesting conversations on managing cyber risk. Until next time.